está aqui hoje com uma entrevista sobre mídia locativa com o professor da Universidade da Califórnia, San Diego, Brad Stalbaum, que é um dos grandes pensadores sobre o tema, uma das pessoas que inventou basicamente o conceito de mídia locativa. E nós, enfim, vou fazer duas perguntas para ele. A primeira é o que é, como se define mídia locativa, e a segunda, quais são as futuras aplicações das mídias locativas. Well, I introduce you, if you want to introduce yourself, and I have only two questions. So, could you define, like, in 2 minutes what's locative media?
In 2 minutes?
Yeah,
Wow.
5 minutes, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And what are the future applications of locative media that we could describe or think of, the uses of all this?
All right, so I'm kind of late mid-career in the worlds of computing and the arts. And, you know, by way of introduction, I don't really want to say much except it goes to the point of your question, which is, you know, in the 1990s I was involved in sort of a generation of artists that generally called internet art, sometimes more specifically in a particular milieu of practice, net art. And in the 1990s, the internet was this new thing, right? At least, in fact, it's a very old thing, but it was a new thing to a lot of artists, and it was new to the public. This is a time when the internet first became part of really a broad public awareness, when people began to be able to have an internet connection in their home. I got my first internet connection at my house in 1993 or thereabouts. So this is when, you know, we were first starting to have an imaginary about it and try to treat that as a particular medium of our artistic expression. Mm-hmm. And, you know, look for its medium-specific properties, look for its intersections or lack of intersections with culture, you know, examine who has the internet, what's the level of privilege, who doesn't. You know, as a broad movement, I'm not saying I was involved in all of those activities, but as a broad movement, it was really about looking at the internet as a thing that we were very aware of as a technology at the time. Okay, and, you know, shortly into the sort of what we might call the Web 2.0 era, you know, 2002 and after the dot-com bomb, and with the rise of social media, especially really successful sites like Facebook or, you know, Snapchat, all of the social media that's out there, we you know, began to not, a generation began to not see the internet anymore. Mm-hmm. It became a normalized technology, right?
Like electricity.
Like electricity, and this is exactly the same thing happened earlier. You know, and the evidence of this was, I think, earlier. It might have been late last year, but I think it was early this year, 2015. Eric Schmidt, the Google guy, made an off-the-cuff remark about, well, the internet is dead. And it went all around the internet, and everybody was like freaked out. No, what does he mean? This is Google saying the internet is dead. And they had to correct the record a little bit and say what he meant exactly that the internet had become like electricity, mm-hmm. right? We weren't at the point in history where we had there had been this group of artists that really looked at it and its medium-specific properties and how it functioned, and, you know, down to physical factors like its speed, and, you know, and really examined that stuff carefully. And in a way, all the way at this point in history, after that internet has disappeared, that work also kind of disappears a little bit, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. You know, it's very hard for me to explain, you know, some histories of net art to a large lecture hall of 20-year-olds now in the large lecture class, I think. Exactly. One of the things I always have to say throughout my lectures on the history of computing and the arts is that they need to try their best to travel back in time. Mm-hmm. I show them some Roy Ascot work from the early 1980s, where, you know, there was an internet then too. It's usually an opportunity to talk about, the internet's much older than the web, right? But I show them this Roy Ascot work that really took place in a terminal, right? On a command line terminal. You know, they were working with artists around the world to do collaborative storytelling. And you look at that work today, you know, that kind of exploration of sort of networked narrative, and it looks, from even the 1990s, it looks like, you know, wow, that's not too impressive. But because it's a bunch of text on the screen and people chatting with each other, essentially, right? And today, everybody chats with each other in a text-based universe.
It's normal, yeah.
Right? So it's normalized. So it's really hard to see how important, it was called the pleasure of the text. It's really hard to see how important that generation of internet art was. Okay, so this is all preparing to actually then answer your question about GPS. One of the first artists to really embrace GPS art. And by the way, in the 1990s, that's what we called it. Was GPS art. That was the name for it.
Yeah.
Masaki Fujihara did this really kind of important and influential project called Impressing Velocity, in which he was doing things like running up and down Mount Fuji with the early consumer GPS devices when they were still incredibly expensive, and creating gallery exhibitions that were related to the experience. He was also working with digital elevation model data.
Sure.
So they were both doing activities and performances and making sculptures and videos and data visualizations, 3D data renderings of Mount Fuji, kind of convolved with or reinterpreted by the speed of his ascent and descent up the mountain. And it's beautiful stuff, especially very, very early, 1991 to 1993, with GPS. So there was this locative existed back then. The thing later that Mark Tudor's and Carlos Calvin's name locative media. After some really, really important changes in the network and changes in social media, it's really in the early part of the 2000s that it starts to be called locative media.
Mm-hmm.
So. And I guess my larger, so there's some good definitions that came out of that, many definitions. Some of the definitions look at, maybe the more formal properties of GPS and its network potentialities. Other versions of what locative media was sought to intersect define it by exploring the intersection between the technology and the social in a very engaged way, right?
Yeah.
So there are a lot of kind of social projects, and then everything you can imagine, lots of different categories. We can talk about mapping projects, Esther Pollock, Amsterdam Real Time,
Mm-hmm.
a really, really beautiful mapping project that involved remote bicycles sending their location back as people rode them around. But then things that were very non-mapping and very, very other kinds of projects too. So anyway, a lot of practice happens, and oh, by the way, another definition potentially is it's a combination of certain technologies. So GPS with various network technologies. It can include RFIDs. It can include a lot of other kinds of technology. Lucas Bambozzi here in Brazil explores a lot of those kinds of technologies in a really provocative way in his sculptures, right? Which are really, really beautiful stuff. So there was locative media that became sculptures. There was locative media like the things that you were working on that involved people moving around and mapping and drawing. So, not one definition of it, but kind of multiple definitions of it, ranging from medium specificity to social interactions. And around, this is also around the time of first Nokia and then Apple's the mark that they left on the mobile phone world, and that included GPS for Nokia from the outset. And later, GPS features became a really, really important part of iOS and Android as well.
2000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I get my larger point is locative media probably doesn't exist now. It's a historically situated term that is maybe the first decade of the 21st century, and before that we called it GPS art, and before that artists didn't really have access to the technologies in order. So it's becoming ubiquitous, or it's because it's ubiquitous. It's hard to talk about it being anything other than the way that mobile phone companies talk about location services, right? Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, the shitty imaginary of what these technologies can possibly be eventually overtakes anything that's interesting, right? Internet art in the 1990s was really interesting, and it turns into Facebook, which I love Facebook. I mean, I do. I enjoy Facebook, but you know, it is what it is.
Exactly.
It's very good, but we know what it is, and it, you know, it sort of effaces like some of these more interesting experiments with like the speed of the network. Lisa Jeffrat, the group that I was part of, C5, we're really driven a lot by Lisa Jeffrat, like, you know, visualizing the space of IP addresses, right? These are things that it's hard for artists today to really like, you know, to think about without having that kind of long lecture about sort of historically situating yourself at a time when something like internet art meant something which doesn't anymore, and something like locative media or GPS art meant something that doesn't anymore. So that was a big law.
It's interesting because, yeah, in some ways we can just realize that as the internet basically disappeared, but it's ubiquitous, so it's everywhere. Like the locative media, like we have like the application like that use your location, like Waze or everything. Now, when you take a picture, it's geo-referenced, and you can put a latitude and longitude in the picture. Yeah, you're right. Maybe it doesn't make any sense to use the user.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's weird. It may be a little provocative, but some of the most interesting locative media projects since 2007, 2008 have actually been, and Nokia did this before, I'll try to describe it. It's actually been Apple Maps and its remarkable, notable, somewhat famous failures that are the more interesting things in locative media, like people getting lost, like that Australian national park, and people would put in directions to the park, but the Apple Maps took them to the geographic center of the park and not to the park headquarters, and they would end up in a remote location without gasoline.
Exactly.
There was an example in Alaska where the directions to the airport actually drove cars across the runway. The directions were to drive across the runway, and you know, so it was, you know, these sort of autonomous accidents become like this sort of machinic, accidental performative that is really kind of like really a lot more interesting than a lot of the things that are left to do with it post ubiquity. You know, it's really how the bigger systems failing interestingly become. So I don't work a lot with. I love GPS. I still think about doing projects with it, but whenever it comes time to work on them, I start working on something else because there are bigger things out there.
What do you think that's gonna be the future uses for this? Do you think that they are gonna develop or something that we are not just seeing or expecting?
Well, I mean, you know, it is the matter of what was left on the table, right? With locative media, like what kinds of projects were never really, what kinds of locative media were never fully explored before even that term started to take on a characteristic shape that was recognized by curators. I mean, there were a lot of like wonderfully weird outsider practices with GPS well before art that created these kinds of really interesting artifacts. And there's still something there. What will become of it is, you know, of course in the art world there's the fashion trends. I mean, and you know, definitely locative media is not something that the art and technology curatorial world is terribly interested in right now. Everybody feels like net art. Everybody feels a little bit done with it, right? So I don't know. If there are different futures, it's because GPS will get out of our device. Well, it won't be centered on the experience of our devices. Be new kinds of devices, right? So maybe augmented reality in space and place.
Augmented reality.
Yeah, you know, moving around. You know, what kind of product? It'll be the same GPS system, which is an old system, but a new kind of user interface. You know, with which to that requires some new metaphors and new experimental techniques in order to experience the relationship between person, computational mediation, and the world. That, you know, something could emerge from these things. I mean, a very fascinating thing to me is global positioning system on small system on a chip boards. which don't have a user interface. You know, so we can start to think about a robotic GPS.
Okay. So, well, I would like to thank you very much for this interview, amazing interview. I think that the students are going to be very happy. My students are online and from Unifesp. We are testing a new online course, like with multi-campus, like trying to do something around together like 5 campuses, people from all around, you know, and it's about digital language, this new thing. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eu queria agradecer ao Brett e depois eu vou passar vários textos para vocês, em que ele já escreveu, que eu fiz a tradução e a gente já trabalha há algum tempo, quase 10 anos já em projetos na área de mídias digitais e mídias locativas lá com a Universidade da Califórnia, em San Diego. Bom, é isso aí, pessoal. Espero que vocês tenham gostado da entrevista.